The Feudal Future Podcast.
Hello and welcome to a very special edition of the Feudal Future Podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And we are sitting here just before New Year's 2024. This is going to be our year in review show. And actually, we were kind of thinking, why are we going to do a year in review show? Nothing of any interest or import happened at all this year. But then we were, maybe something happened that was. So, Joel, what do you think? I mean, it's been a heck of a year. What stands out to you as kind of the big deal?
Well, I think the big story, and I would say this on a global level in interviews we did in Europe and South Africa, and involving Latin America. I think what's clearly happened is that the kind of world order as imagined in, let's say, Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History, of this liberal, rules-based order is just essentially fallen apart. That we're now in a period in which there's enormous amounts of global conflict. We're back into the, if you will, the age of empires. I think that we're seeing a kind of very typically feudal rebellion of those parts of populations, whether they're in Africa or in the United States or in Mexico, of people who feel that they've been left behind. And this time in the United States, they went with Trump and the Republicans, who have been traditionally the party of wealth.
It's interesting that you should say that, because it feels like we're in an era of renewed pragmatism where people just care about their bread and butter issues, personal safety. Am I making enough to make a living? Am I, is my family getting ahead? And a lot of the ideological discussion about things like climate change, the importance of climate change, these seem to be being pushed to
like transgenderism.
Yeah, right. Exactly. The solving, the balming of the world's ills in the past. These things seem to be moving toward the background now as people start thinking about issues that are more important to them in the day-to-day.
And probably one of the most interesting parts for us has been, since we've done all this work this year on Latinos, is the fact that Donald Trump got close to a majority of the Latino vote. This is exactly the voter you're talking about. It's the one who's worried about, is my child going to school and learning anything? Is it, am I going to have a job? Is my job at the, at the port, at the steel mill, at the logistics center, is that being threatened by energy policy? Is it also going to be threatened by technology? And this is kind of a pushback that we're going through. Is you can almost see what's happening, and what's fascinating is it's happening all over the world.
Doesn't it strike you as odd that let's take Latinos as an example, because we've done a tremendous amount of work there. Here it is. You have a Donald Trump who's saying we're going to have the largest mass deportations in the history of the United States, very clearly focusing on Latino countries. And Latin countries, and yet Latinos who are living here are going, yeah, man, go for it. We're up. Doesn't it seem kind of odd to you?
Well, it seems odd unless you actually pay attention. Right. Part of the thing is that academics in particular will say, oh, well, Latinos relate to other Latinos. Well, Latinos are people.
And they have the same aspirations everybody else has.
Exactly. Right. And if I'm let's say doing work, I'm working in a factory, or I'm a truck driver, and all of a sudden some guy from Venezuela is willing to do it for half the price. Right. That's not very good for me. Right. If I have limited services, this has happened in Chicago and New York, where your local park has been taken over by a migrant camp. And what seems to have happened is the Democrats have become so sort of convinced about their ideology that they've forgotten to serve the people.
Well, and part of that ideology has been identity politics.
Exactly.
Right, which I have to say, one of our episodes that we had this year that I remember most was Mike Madrid.
Oh, right.
Just before the election saying to us, you guys made a big mistake with your research calling it El Futuro es Latino. Don't put it in Spanish. Latinos don't want to be pandered to in Spanish. They want to be treated like any other American group, which kind of made me realize, well, is that true of other identity politic groups, right? The idea of identity politics is that you're an aggrieved minority that somehow has been done wrong, and we have to undo all of that. Is that really extending across all groups, or how do you feel about that?
Well, I think it's across a lot of groups. It's it's kind of the victimization Olympics. But the problem is, while that may help university professors, DEI professionals, people maybe in the media, it doesn't help the average person. And so, if you take a look at each group, African Americans, at some point, African Americans, particularly African American men, are beginning to realize that this is not a good deal for them. That there has been very little progress made since the 1980s. Then you take a look at some of the other groups. Even you have, let's say, the gay community. How is the gay community helped by identifying with Islamic fundamentalism?
Right.
It's as a friend of mine calls it, chickens for KFC. I mean that. Or if you take a look, obviously Latinos are a good example. Asians. Now, part of the theory was Asians, well, they're people of color. Well, first of all, Asians are an amazingly diverse group, like Hispanics. Their social characteristics are very much merit-oriented. Well, DEI basically destroys the merit system. The Asian community has long focused on that. By the way, same thing is true with the Jewish community. Jewish community, the way you got ahead was by working hard and doing well in school. That was the formula.
And by becoming a doctor.
Right.
As my mother always reminded me, and I deeply disappointed her.
I didn't have to do that because my father was a doctor. but the reality is that we forget that these groups are diverse, that they're complex. That there are certainly elements of Trumpism that would turn them off. But there are many elements of Harris that turned them off. I mean, I think the biggest issue may not even have been how the minority groups voted, but how many people didn't vote. That they couldn't get people to come out after spending $1.3 billion.
Although we did have arguably very high turnout in this election, more so than we have had in previous elections overall.
Right, but the total number of votes, like, for instance, Trump has basically just repeated what he did before. Harris is, several million votes less than Biden had. Yeah. So the question is not, we on this, podcast, we don't support one political party or another. I just think both parties are heading into a serious question with the realignment. Can the Republican Party, which depends still on very rich people who finance it, can they find an agenda that works for working class people? The Democrats have got to move away from the cultural stuff and move more
and talk about relying on rich donors. They do too. I mean, gone are the day of Bernie Sanders saying, I've got 7 million people who gave me $2. That was the working class approach of then. And today it's rich oligarchs that are putting money into both sides of the equation.
Right. I mean,
but let's.
By the way, just on the feudal theme, it's almost like we have the conflict between Lord Musk and Lord Gates.
True. Two
unbelievably wealthy people who have more money than any people have ever had in history, and they're fighting each other. It's
it seems like a Star Wars episode.
The War of the Roses.
Well, so let's kind of put a fork in it. The election is over. Trump won. He won the popular vote as well as the electoral vote. There's a certain set of expectations that came with Trump's being elected. What do you think he is now obligated to do?
I think the biggest problem, and this is a problem that politicians should have to face in general, they got to deliver something economically. Trump in many ways was reelected because actually the period from until the pandemic was one of the more prosperous periods in American history. But he's going to have to deliver on those jobs. It can't just be, well, now you have to pay 20% more for everything you buy at Walmart. You've got to be saying, yeah, but there's a factory now producing the product that used to come from China, and that's employing a bunch of people. So he's going to have to deliver on that level. He's also going to have to deliver in this dealing with the undocumented. How does he do it in a humane way? How does he do it in a way that's acceptable? I think right now, I think they're very clever to focus on the criminal elements,
right?
And because I think there'll be almost universal belief in that. But he's going to have to deliver a lot of things. He's going to have to deliver to the people, the urban communities which didn't vote for him but voted more heavily for him by supporting charter schools, homeschooling. Look what's happened.
Well, let's face it. We've seen the data in California.
Oh God, yeah.
The percentage of students that have passed the basic skills in English, reading and math are just abysmal.
Well, one recent study is only 1/3 of Americans nationwide in fourth grade can read at grade level.
Yeah.
There's no way we compete as a country. And so the question is, does Trump have an answer to that? And then for the Democrats, can they perhaps find a way of taking some of the stronger parts of the Trump program, but making it more human, making it more socially just? And the question is whether they have the ability to do it. We're sitting here in California and they're talking about running Kamala Harris as governor. And I'm just saying, this is a person who just ran one of the most wasteful, stupid campaigns in history, has shown no ability to be no matter how many movie stars and pop stars she appears with, there's no way to make Kamala Harris an attractive person.
Well, we're talking about also 2 years from now, just as that story comes out about Kamala going out and thinking about running, you have Gavin Newsom, who basically woke up and said, oops, Trump won in a lot of places in California. I better start shoring up support on behalf of the party. So that's going to be interesting. But here's the overlay. Politics is always politics. If the issues are really bread and butter, am I going to have a job that pays something decently? Is my family going to get ahead? Am I going to be able to have affordable housing someplace at any time in my life? All of these things are kind of dependent upon an economic model where people work. What happens with AI coming in? It is happening at an unbelievably explosive rate. All the wishful thinking in the world, and maybe all the great economic planning policy in the world, is not going to erase the fact that AI is going to bring massive unemployment. How do you think that's going to affect all of this?
Well, that's going to be really an important issue, and I think it's going to be an important issue. And again, oddly enough, is going to make the working class even more important. Because the interesting thing about AI is yes, it will eliminate some lower income jobs, but it's also going to eliminate lots of high income jobs. That whole learn to code business is kind of ridiculous. As one of our early guests, Ronnie Alvovitz made the point, it's not going to be my son, the coder is going to be my son, the plumber. And if we can build up that tactile part of the economy, the tangible part of the economy, I think whoever can deliver that is going to be in a good position, because I think where we're going to see some real problems and there's been some very good writing on this recently. We overproduce elites. We overproduce too many of kids. I know because we both teach and we can hear about the students.
Well, and you hear stories about taxi cab drivers in India having PhDs.
Right.
And I wonder whether we're kind of moving into that same direction. We've somehow, I love the word tactile economy.
Right.
I think that we're going to have to use that now. So please copyright that. But the maintenance of physical infrastructure, both infrastructure in a building structural sense and infrastructure as human beings.
Like healthcare.
Those are the last bastions of humanity in the sense of human labor required to be able to do it. So I think if you think about if that's where the future is going to be, what do we need to do differently from the education system? You know, I remember when we had metal shop and wood shop in high school.
Right.
You don't have that anymore. And maybe this is the kind of stuff when we were in an industrial mode, maybe this is the kind of stuff we need to go back to.
And I think that the key thing, and you know, we have to take some responsibility as teaching ourselves, you know, that we have to understand that not everybody should go to college. Not everybody should get a 4-year degree. And if we are going to do that, they have to come out with real skills. I mean, I could see a phenomena where, you know, people go out and they essentially mail in the degree because, you know, the AI does all the homework. Who needs those people? I need somebody who can fix the screen door of my house. You need somebody who can do a scan. You need somebody who can drive a truck that will bring blueberries from Washington State to
right. And it's unlikely to be a robo truck. It's
right.
probably going to be humans involved somehow.
Certainly for the foreseeable future.
Well, you know, it's funny because that implies that there's some hope here, right?
Yes.
I was reading an article the other day about foreign direct investment in the United States, and it compared us to all the other countries in the world. The total amount of money that comes into the United States in investment, which is basically people saying, hey, I want to invest in the U.S. economy because I think there's going to be a return. It's a hopeful place, is more by a large, large factor than every other country on the planet combined.
And that's what's going to be very interesting. And maybe, you know, to give our listeners a little bit of hope, America is fundamentally in great shape. You know, Trump talks all the America weak and all that. And some of what he's saying is true. But basically, compared to everyone else, we're just kicking butt. And not only that, but China is faced with some very, very severe issues. You know, they're very vulnerable on resources. They're not employing their young, educated people.
Birth rate is very, very, very much reduced.
Right. I mean, the birth rate in Beijing and Shanghai is the lowest ever.
Well, I read an article that looked at the potential world population in 2150. And the estimate for China was 500 million people. Today it's 1.3 billion people. That's quite a reduction. I mean, look at what that kind of hollowing out has done for Japan.
And you think about it, the population will be older, and China does not have a well-developed social security system. I mean, its medical system is not, you know, anything like what we have in this country. So I think we have a period where China has some vulnerabilities. Russia is just at this stage basically a criminal enterprise of limited appeal. I mean, I don't see where people want to duplicate that.
Lots of oil, lots of natural gas.
Right.
That's that's what's fueling it.
Right. I mean, that's the whole thing. And of course, you know, the United States produces more of both than Russia does. So I think the opportunity for America is great. And I think one of the things that I feel very strongly about is the fact that I think our system has managed to deal with this. And, you know, I think one of the things that always bothers me is in both parties, but particularly the Democrats these days, they want to get rid of all the constitutional restraints. You know, it's interesting, all these people saying, oh, we want to get rid of the filibuster. Oh, but now the Republicans might be able to
forget about that, right?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that we have these checks and balances, even though I think he's a preening mediocrity, Governor Newsom, it's good that states fight the federal government, whether it's Texas fighting Biden or California
it
fighting
shouldn't be
Trump.
a slam dunk hegemony, right?
The founding fathers were really smart, and you don't want to mess with the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court's always going to be a lagging indicator. Very, very liberal Supreme Courts went through the entire period during Reagan and later on, even when there were Republican governments, you had a more liberal Supreme Court. Even if, let's say, the Democrats come back in 2026 and 2028, you're probably going to have a conservative judiciary for the foreseeable future.
Well, and what would be the trigger for the Democrats coming back? Would it be, I doubt it would be identity politics, which has really been kind of the hallmark of Democratic policies and politics over the last couple of decades. What do you think it would be?
I think it's economics. It's the old James Carville, it's the economy, stupid. And I think that, let's just say we end up with, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but the tariffs cause a huge inflation. There's social disruption from the deportations. The U.S. gets involved in trade wars with some of our leading trading partners. I think there's a lot of ways. Trump is a deal maker, and at his best, he's a great deal maker. But he's had his failures. North Korea didn't exactly work out very well.
So foreign policy is an issue that we probably want to explore a little bit. It's great to make America great again, right? It's great to reassert American leadership. But it's a new world, right? It's a new world where resources are being realigned and countries are being realigned. What do you think? Will it be jingoism, or will we find a better way of assimilating ourselves into a new world order?
Well, I think it's about realpolitik, the return of this idea that, I think it was one of the British prime ministers who said that Britain had no permanent friends, but only permanent interests. And I think one thing that I think Trump will bring, and I think is positive, is an understanding of realpolitik. He's not saying America should control everything, and every time there's a problem, we should send the army. Quite different in his perspective. But we have to begin to have a notion that, yes, America is still by far the most important and powerful country in the world, but there are some really strong competitors out there.
Does realpolitik mean lack of an overarching strategy?
I think it means that you make your decisions based on what is in the interest of your country, as opposed to some sort of ideological construct.
Interest of your country at the moment,
right? And in the foreseeable future. Mm-hmm. I mean, it doesn't seem to me that the Europeans, with their energy policy, are exactly doing anything good for Europe. As we discussed when we were talking about with people in South Africa, why are Western diplomats telling a country like South Africa, which has huge coal deposits, that you got to go to wind and solar? Like, it's not going to happen. Right. There isn't the money for it.
Do you feel as though we're getting outplayed by the Chinese in particular?
And part of the reason we've been outplayed is the Chinese are playing realpolitik. That's the only thing they would do, period. China is not advertising itself as we have the solution of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, that they're not selling that. They want to sell refrigerators. They want to sell EVs, which
they want to sell economic growth for themselves.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And to turn, I've been reading a lot on this in Chinese history, and you've studied Chinese history too. The China doesn't want a bunch of colonies, and Beijing is never going to be London, where all the former colonials have gone. And you go to London now, and its majority is people mostly from the empire. Beijing doesn't want to be 50% made up of
It's funny you should say that,
people
because
from other countries.
if you look at the history of China and you go back to the Warring States period, this is, a couple of thousand years ago, the equivalent of the British Commonwealth is what was created in the Qin dynasty, which was bringing together all the warring states into one place. So at that point in time, that was what their model was. But now we kind of forget that. Right now there's one kind of Han Chinese, ubiquitous block.
But
at one time it was that.
But it also had vassal states as opposed to colonies, which are exhausting to maintain, as Europe found out. I would imagine that, we really have we benefited from the Philippines and Puerto Rico. I'm not so sure those are the best decisions we ever made. Alaska was a much better one. But I would say, look, you have a world situation in which, you're going to compete against people who are very much into their own self-interest. And also, by the way, there's a cultural element, whether it's in Iran with Islam, or Russia with the Greek Orthodox, or China with, I guess you could almost call it Hanism, the sort of this ancient culture that has really been there. We're competing against those people. Those people are not talking about a rules-based order. They're talking about arrangements with other countries that benefit themselves and, in some cases benefit the other countries. I mean, as one of our guests, Walter Russell Mead, said, the African government will say, well, we go to the West, we get a lecture. We go to China, we get an airport, and so we are being outplayed. And it wasn't so long ago that during the AIDS crisis, President Bush really became very popular and really addressed the issue in Africa. We don't seem to have that anymore. We don't have, we maybe make ideological comments. We apologize and say, oh, I'm so sorry. So our guests have been saying, like, they give a speech in South Africa and the first, 20 minutes is apologizing. Meanwhile, the Chinese are making deals. We are certainly being outplayed. And I think, if anything, I think there is a sort of intrinsic sense in America. I don't think foreign policy is the big driver in America, but there's an intrinsic sense that we're being played, and that what Trump, for all the things that are terrible about him, he doesn't want to be played. Right. And he doesn't want the United States to be played by whether it's, Islamic terrorists or the Russians or the Chinese. He doesn't go there and say, well, you're a horrible regime that's repressive and does all these terrible things. Okay. That's the world that we grew up in. When the United States was in its infancy, one of our great allies was Tsarist Russia. Right. You can't find anything more different from American ideals than Tsarist Russia. But Tsarist Russia supported us against the English, so we're going to be.
My father used to have a wonderful expression, so I ain't neat. So, okay, let's get people chance to imbibe, go for their second glass of wine or another beer, and let them go into the new year and have a great time with it. But let's sum it up. So we call this thing, we're now going into our fourth season.
Wow.
Which is amazing to think about that. Thank you very much, listeners and viewers, for listening to us. We appreciate your indulging us in our rants. But we started this out with the notion that the world was becoming more feudal. Not futile, although sometimes we kind of wonder that, but feudal in the sense of feudalism had certain characteristics. So are we more or less feudal this year than last year?
I think that, let's just say we're now facing the crisis of feudalism. The feudal system, as we saw it, was a group of very powerful people, most particularly on the tech side, were able to manipulate society and seem to be, and they may still in the long run win that conflict. What this year has been about, and I think the coming years, is the struggle of the third estate in the old French sense. The everything from the working class to the small business owner. These are the people who have decided to rebel, and what's exciting to watch from a historian's point of view is it's happening in Germany, it's happening in France, it's happening in the UK, it's happening in the Netherlands.
Triumph of the bourgeoisie,
or at least a rebellion of the bourgeoisie, and certainly of the middle and working classes. I think that's the big issue, and the big issue for both President-elect Trump, but also for Meloni in Italy, Wilders in the Netherlands, some of the more conservative governments that have been elected in Europe, the new conservative government in Korea. They're going to really have to figure out, how do we meet this challenge that's coming from Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and do we have to play the game maybe a little bit differently, a little bit less ideologically, and a little bit more practically?
Well, Joel, it's been a pleasure this year to be doing the podcast with you. I look forward to doing it again next year. Happy New Year to you and your family. Happy New Year to you. And we hope it is a prosperous, healthy, and peaceful one. And thank you for being part of the Feudal Future podcast.
The Feudal Future.